Okay, I'll get straight to the point. The bucket of tea has made a return. So, as much as I love military technology, and I'm going to continue to talk about that from time to time, I guess, what I'd like to go over is the other side of the defence industry, the side that I think is largely and wrongly ignored, the defence firms themselves. Everyone loves to see explosions, everyone loves to see the development of humanity's technological capability. That is obvious. But I think largely defence firms are ignored and they shouldn't be. So I'm going to be covering a number of defence firms generally, sort of trying to keep engaged with some products of theirs, innovation that they're carrying out, and perhaps information pertaining to the more corporate side of a firm, and give general overviews of them, sort of what they're notable for or infamous for, how they made their name, and my opinion on them. So perhaps reaching into the more financial side of these firms, sort of the nexus, perhaps not the nexus, but the axiom that is the combination between business and defense, and it's an important axiom. So we'll see in which direction I go, but generally I am really quite passionate about the firms themselves, and the technology is really a byproduct of that. So you have the combination of business systems and sort of defense weapons systems or systems pertaining to defense, and I think that's incredibly interesting. So we're going to look a bit more at these sort of industrial, technological behemoths, as it were, that provide the means by which to defend our nation and our allies' nations, but also develop humanity's technological capability. So we're going to look at them more in themselves for the entity that they are, which is largely ignored, as I've said. So I love looking at the complex systems that the defense industry produces. That's, ships and tanks and helicopters, but more than that, the firms themselves. So what I've come to realize over the past year and a half is that while ships are incredibly complex, and, in my preface to the Type 31 frigate video, I said ships are so complex, it's very difficult to sort of summarize them in one video, to explain them, to do them justice without talking about them for a long, long time. The Type 31 frigate has a crew of about 100 to 140. And I don't know how it applies to the Navy, but let's just say in regard to support crew, to be dramatic, there's 20 times the crew needed. That's, in the end, about 2,900 people to run Type 31, an incredibly complex weapons system. Well, Babcock, the firm that sort of makes it, has 31,220 employees. So, speaking from that point of view, Babcock is inherently, I'd say, as a firm, far more complex than the Type 31 frigate is. And so when you have a combination of complex firms producing complex technology, what we can really see is some amazing processes taking place, and that are often sort of an integration of these complex systems in the firm in order to try to achieve complex systems elsewhere. So I think that's rather important, and that's not just engineering. That's finance, that's funding, that's bidding, that's all sorts, that's supply chains. So I think that's really interesting to talk about, and actually rather important to talk about. Now, this is more of an acknowledgement, this part. I do understand that talking about defence firms can get very controversial, but frankly, not that I don't care, I don't think it's anything to be too worried about. Certainly nothing to shy away from. Controversy is present in any industry, and, I'm someone who believes that controversial topics are both the most interesting and the most important to discuss. In regard to people's opinions on defence firms, I think, I'll make myself clear here, generally defence firms themselves are less controversial than comparable industries. Now, why is that? because there are plenty of industries that deal with government, and that inherently creates tension. But the industry of defence, people's dislike of it, or people's distaste for it, or people's perhaps misunderstanding of it, generally doesn't actually come from their dislike of the firm in itself. Their dislike of the firm comes from the relation of the firm to the public, to the military, to the government, and also the person's own sort of philosophical, ethical, political, social thoughts on the idea of war, the idea of pacifism, or, because it's involved with governments, the concept of public spending. So there's a lot to unravel here. And these questions, these ethical questions, are something we'll also try to tackle, or at least explain more clearly, perhaps because there is a lot of noise around the defence industry. There's a lot of, shouting on either side. So I think that's something important to address. But fundamentally, those ethical concerns are concerns that have been debated for thousands of years, because they are some of the most basic philosophical questions that there are. Not to say that they are simple in their basic nature, but that they are inherent, they're fundamental to the human condition. So I think that's something important to discuss. And also, the role of defence firms fluctuates in the world, and moves us into an innovative age that is, I would say, largely unparalleled. But anyway, I'll have to do ethical, political perspectives on war, and my own view on the firms involved as well. You'll have to really see that on a case-by-case basis. I'll be covering various firms, but as with the usual proclivity, as you've probably already noticed, to be more Anglo-centric, more Eurocentric, more West-centric, perhaps even in a manner that sort of accidentally mimics the polarization of time from the time zones starting at Greenwich Mean Time. So, given the firms that we're going to be talking about, which I think make the most interesting technology, I'm going to be talking about the ones that I'm most generally familiar with, and the ones that I think are making the most interesting technology. But hopefully at points I can branch out beyond this, give a little context on the international competition dynamics, on the notion of developmental and structural differences between notorious defence firms in other national powerhouses per se. And I think if anyone can read between the lines, that's Russia and China and famous firms there. So I'll cover various firms, but I've decided a few firms which will certainly get their own overview and likely over time updates, maybe even history, or sort of additional content. The firms that I sort of like to cover, or at least get covered, are BAE Systems, Babcock International Group, Leonardo, Thales, Airbus, Lockheed Martin, Kinetic, Raytheon, Boeing, Northrop Grumman, Rolls-Royce Holdings, Dassault, Rheinmetall, General Dynamics, and L3 Harris, among many others that are sort of fitting into a more background role, that are incorporated into larger firms or subsidiaries of larger firms, or engage at some point along the supply chains. Sorry to be laconic, but that's it. Just thought I might give a heads up.